Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Thursday, June 22nd. Thank you for joining us for our Discover with UH webinar series, a monthly webinar series dedicated to exploring the intersection of healthcare, clinical research, and social justice, and shining the spotlight on researchers across the UH system and the great work that they're doing towards advancing science and medicine. This month, we turn on focus to exploring men's health and research in honor of Men's Health Month. According to the Department of Health and Human Services, men are at higher risk for many serious diseases, including heart disease, lung cancer, and HIV. Men also face unique health problems that don't affect women, like prostate cancer. We're excited to be joined by our esteemed panel of physicians, scientists, and clinicians who will be talking with us today about their research. I am Patricia Tursteniak with the Clinical Research Center, and I will serve as your moderator for today. I will provide introductions of our panelists, and then they will move into their presentations. And afterwards, we will have time for questions and answers. First, I'd like to introduce Dr. Daniel Spratt. Dr. Spratt is the chairman and professor of radiation oncology at University Hospitals and Case Western Reserve University. He received his medical degree from Vanderbilt University and completed his residency in radiation oncology from Memorial Sloan Kettering. He furthered his career by attending the University of Michigan and developed a large NIH-funded large NIH-funded translational and clinical research group while holding leadership roles in the NHA prostate spore and U10 LAPS group. This led him to receiving many awards and recognition in teaching, mentorship, research, and becoming a tenured professor faster than any other faculty member. Dr. Spratt is an international expert in the management of prostate cancer, which supports his research expertise in the development and validation of prognostic and predictive biomarkers used to personalize treatment of cancer patients while avoiding over and under treatment. Currently, he serves on study sections for multiple national foundations, has published over 300 peer-reviewed manuscripts, mentored over 30 students, and is a member of several cancer committees. His passion for radiation oncology drives him to create a world-class department of radiation oncology that provides the best personalized and compassionate care. Welcome, and thank you for being with us today. Our second panelist is Dr. Randy Vence. Dr. Vence is the director of Minorities Men's Health at the Cutler Center for Men at University Hospitals, is an assistant professor of urology at Case Western Reserve University. He attended Townsend University, where he pursued a double major in molecular biology, biochemistry, and bioinformatics and chemistry. Later, he attended Louisiana State University Health Sciences Center to complete his medical degree and completed his residency at Virginia Commonwealth University Health Systems. In addition to his medical degree, he obtained a master's degree in computational medicine and bioinformatics. It was his family that enhanced his passion for urologic oncology and his education that sparked his interest in using precision medicine to combat the concept of racial biology and evaluate environment and gene expression on tumor biology. His research includes prostate cancer disparities, which aims to identify areas to improve prostate cancer outcomes. With his personal passion and work in research, he hopes to address the disparities of prostate cancer and better understand the long-term impacts on social determinants of health. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Vence. We've asked Dr. Pratt and Dr. Vence to talk with us today about their recent work and research that they're proud of to shine light on the great work our researchers are doing to help shape the medical landscape. With that, I would like to invite Dr. Pratt to the stage to present at this time.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share my slides. So as you said, my name's Dr. Dan Spratt, and it's a great pleasure to speak with all of you today, and really honored to share this panel with Dr. Randy Vence. who I've been fortunate to get to know and get to work with and learn from a number of years. And so this talk is a kind of a hybrid of what my journey is and into medicine, into men's health, and into social justice, and then really sort of a change or frame shift of the way my research has pivoted. And a lot of it's, as Dr. Vince will go over, some of the really important findings and work that he's led. So my journey to men's health and social justice. So those who don't know me, you can look at me as many different things. I have 3 brothers. So my poor mom had 4 boys and a dad. So I grew up in a house of males. Had a very interesting life as I was raised as a Jewish. My mom was Jewish. Her family was Orthodox. My father's family was in Salt Lake City, where I was born, in Utah. They decided to get married, and both were basically ostracized from their families. So we became a very close-knit family. And you can see just in the map, I've moved a lot in my life, all over the US. And, my passion really wasn't set out. There's no doctors in my family. It wasn't something that I was, told to go into medicine, didn't actually know anyone in healthcare even. And was a definitely below average student. So for those who are pulling, C and D grades in high school, hope is not lost. But I was very fortunate to be sort of inspired during my days as a personal trainer to essentially figure out ways to help patients and to see the beauty of science, the beauty of research, the beauty of medicine, to have really big impact. And so, as sort of was highlighted, I've been very fortunate to get to work with great people, and ended up in the field of oncology. And so what early on connected me to cancer patients was probably when I did a gyn-onc rotation. When I was doing OB, and we had maybe a week on gyn-onc. But for those that don't treat cancer patients, and I'm going through medical school, and obviously there's many, many important conditions that we, patients deal with every day. Obesity, diabetes, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, a multitude of things. But there was something that I really saw uniquely when I was taking care of cancer patients, that once they heard the C word, it just hit them like nothing else. It wasn't like a broken bone. It wasn't like they, said they have high cholesterol. It's something that even if it ended up being a non-lethal cancer, it just really had this profound effect. And it wasn't just on the patient, it was on their whole family, their friend group, sometimes even their community. And so to be sort of part of that really, meant something to me. And the other aspect of it, and those of us who take care of cancer patients, you can have the healthiest, most wealthy person that's been vegan their whole life, exercised every day, and at 30 they can develop, widely metastatic cancer. And so you're immune in the sense that anyone can get cancer. Sadly, even kids can get cancer. There's obviously things we can do to minimize that risk, but everyone can get it. And I was drawn really to prostate cancer. And while there's a massive spectrum of who gets prostate cancer, many of the patients that I see and that I take care of, probably more than half of them, it's probably the first major diagnosis of a health condition that they would view as major in their life. And so it causes a lot of, so not just the physical aspects of needing to go through cancer treatment, but the mental and emotional aspects, because a lot of these men, usually in their 60s, they can obviously be younger or older, but they've worked their whole life, they've used to being in control, they've never necessarily faced their own mortality. And it starts confronting many of them with anxieties, fears, concerns, or it inspires them, and they start really looking at the purpose and meaning of their life, their family. And so there's just this journey you get to go on them with. And it has this very unique duality, and in that it's unique in that so many patients don't, about a third of men may not even need their cancer treated, but it still carries that C word that they have to deal with. but it still is the second leading cause of cancer death in men. So it's something that, this is a real disease. This kills, sadly, many men throughout the world. And so we can't ignore it. And so, throughout my training, and, a lot of these photos are at my prior institution, when I sort of got really full blown and focused on prostate cancer. And this is sort of how it will lead into focusing on social justice and disparities, is, and this is publicly online, so there's no HIPAA issues, but this is one of my patients who every day back in the days, now we do 5 treatments of radiation. Back then we did 42 treatments, and every single one of his treatments, he figured out a new way to put on his body or make a symbol to denote what treatment number he was on, and made a whole video collage. But it's just really inspiring to kind of be on this journey with these guys, working with great multidisciplinary teams with urologists. And this is where I met Dr. Vince, and, having a lot of fantastic mentees that took over my position when I left. This is Dr. Bob Dess. And, really, I think this multi-pronged approach, it was a way for me to make a difference. And, this is a photo of a Rotary Club, which, this is, that and patient advocacy groups is just a fantastic way to sort of get to hear from patients rather than just my colleagues. But a lot of people know me as just a huge nerd. I'm obsessed, very focused on research. But, the purpose of the research is really to, get answers to questions of how we can make things better for patients. And so, as I went through and developed my research career, I would ask things like, what's the importance of, let's just say, PSA, or the grade of the cancer, or the age of a patient, and even getting into much more complex things that I'm really not going to get into about genomics and, even more recently, artificial intelligence derived biomarkers that tell us, how aggressive is a tumor, which patients need which treatment. And sort of through all of this, and I started to look at, because in prostate cancer, there's a big focus, and you'll see it, I mean, for decades, race is something that is discussed frequently. It's frequently reported on. And I would be sitting on study sections for various grant mechanisms, and all these grants coming in, and these papers I read are in this hunt with these 10 patient cohorts, 50 patient cohorts, trying to identify why is it that Black men are getting more or dying more of prostate cancer. And so kind of early in my career, I just sort of looked at, again, thinking it as race is just another one of these variables I had been studying. And you look across the TCGA, that's the Cancer Genome Atlas, and it was, at least for, African-American patients, was reasonably representative, and it was intentional, but it was reasonably representative if you look at the distribution of patients that had their tumor sequenced versus the US population. But this really also brought up some other questions, in that I was wondering, why on earth have people not figured out why Black men were having these more adverse outcomes? And while the TCGA, which is, while it's amazing, it's still, right, we're talking about in the hundreds and thousands, not millions. But if you look at GWAS studies, genome-wide association studies, right, there's barely any African American. This is in 2009. Obviously this has changed over time, but it pretty much was solely European ancestry. So there just wasn't a lot of relative or absolute numbers. And so this is a very highly cited paper from Nature that looked at how many basically patients or tumors you would need to sequence to be able to detect some mutation above and beyond that tumor's baseline kind of mutational frequency. And so what this is looking at is, if you see here on the left, for many tumor types, there was plenty of samples to detect a mutation that was at a 5% frequency rate. So it's not that rare. But if you look in Black patients, and pretty much any racial minority, there's pretty much no tumor type to even have enough samples to potentially detect this. And as I said, at this time, and this is from 1997, the way research was reported, and Dr. Vince will get into this more, but this is how I was trained. And this is actually a very prominent African-American urologist in the field, very well respected. And this is, one of his papers showing that, African-American men have more pathologically locally advanced prostate cancer than white American men. And that race is an independent predictor of positive margins, so adverse pathology in men with prostate cancer, and should be included in treatment decisions. So this is that framework, which is many would call race-based research. But then, studies like this started to come out more and more often, where what this is showing you is if you focus on this blue line here, and it's comparing the survival of Black versus white men, that when you look at things completely unadjusted, you just take the only thing you're looking at is the color of their skin or how they self-identify their race, Black men have significantly worse survival. But as you start to factor in variables, marital status, socioeconomic variables, insurance variables, you start to see that, well, really, do they actually do worse? And is this biology? Is this social determinants of health? It's unclear. And this sort of led to a hypothesis, a big study that we put out that, as I mentioned, actually it was oddly controversial, which I would never have thought so. And what we did is we took 3 large cohorts. One is, a population cohort, SEER, hundreds of thousands of men, a VA cohort where theoretically, access to care, that disparity should be minimized if you're a veteran, whether you're Black or white. I always say this is not the same as an equal access, because just because at the VA you are able to have healthcare covered, it doesn't mean things are equal. And then a very large, and the largest of its kind, randomized trial cohort where we pooled together individual patient data from a number of randomized trials. And what I'm showing you here is that PCSM is death from prostate cancer specific mortality, in that even in our population data, when you adjust for just basic, clinical variables, age, insurance status, you will see that there is no difference in death from prostate cancer. If you look at the VA cohort, no difference in death from prostate cancer. And actually, and this has been shown now in multiple trials, actually Black men had lower rates of dying from prostate cancer than they did from their, white counterparts. But pretty consistently, Black men were dying of other things, most commonly heart disease, than white men. So it begs the question, what is the disparity we're talking about here? And around this time, obviously, George Floyd, the incident, very tragic, but I think this shook far beyond, I think, just the lay media. I think even the biomedical research community really started to focus on how race was being reported and studied. And this is just one study from Lancet Oncology, just giving some sort of framework into race-based research versus race-conscious medicine. So is it race or is it racism we're talking about here? And so things that I will, I am very transparent and honest in admitting in that my upbringing and, even going through good schools, I was not taught most of this. And whether that's my own ignorance for not seeking it out, but this is stuff that I've learned, after, going even through residency, that race is a social, not genetic construct. Racialization, a term I had never heard in my life till I was over 30 years old, is a societally driven process of assigning people into hierarchical groups. It's what happened to Jews when they, wanted to say they had horns and they were different, and they were no different than in slavery. What was happening? They tried to explain, inferiority and intelligence when it's just based on phenotypic features. And this, it's racialization that at its core is what leads to racism, and systemic or structural racism, right, impacts everything. This isn't just one or two things that this affects. And we often oversimplify things when we talk about genetically inferred ancestry, and people misinterpret race and genetically inferred ancestry, which we are learning. There was just a new paper about a week ago. We're constantly learning more and more about our origins, but this is a biologically method to infer kind of where we moved around. And so people will, lots of very high impact studies will trace things from millions and millions of years ago in migration, right? But when we're talking about race, and especially in the United States, you're talking about a transatlantic slave trade, one of those devastating, things in our history. Racialization is what, typecasted people, and this was the U.S. Census definition. This is the U.S. Census in 1790, how they classified people in the U.S. free whites, other free persons, and slaves. If you go to 2020, this is now how these are social constructs. This is how society defined people. And ultimately, there's racism throughout this, and this can affect biology, right? Gene expression, as Randy will talk about, and clearly social determinants of health and ultimately health outcomes. And so, as I said, I was fortunate to meet Dr. Vince. He started his fellowship at University of Michigan and, continued to sort of expand my horizons in how to view this. And this was a pretty profound paper that Dr. Vince put out in JAMA. And so I'm actually going to take the time to read this because I think this is really powerful, that even as very intelligent, he's a physician, that this is how he, as a Black man, is being taught this as well. That he says, I listened with great discomfort and despair to countless lectures describing all of the diseases that disproportionately harm African Americans. In none of these lectures, however, did any instructor explain or acknowledge that I had observed for so many years that access to care is a primary factor behind these brutal statistics. One moment continues to resonate. As I sat in my usual seat at the back of the lecture hall, a urologist taught our class that African American men are more likely to die from prostate cancer. Once again, I experienced a sense of despair and I wanted to crawl into a corner and disappear. When I asked after class about the role of access to care in driving this disparity, the professor's response was clear and emphatic. No, it's tumor biology. And so when you kind of walk through this, it's almost comical as I go through these slides in hindsight. And comical is probably the wrong word here. It's tragic. But as the biomedical community, to simplify this is some of the smartest people, it's kind of shocking. But you're right, we have our genetic ancestry, we develop these phenotypes, right, based on how we migrate around the world. Obviously, their skin or hair color. Racialization is applied, right? People say, well, you're this way, and this is the social construct of race. Through structural racism, which affects basically almost everything throughout a person in generations of life and stress, of course, there's going to be biological manifestations and impact on health outcome. And so when you look at, and this is still today, and Randy and I see these papers, but when they say there's a difference, or Black men are dying more of this, or Black men get this, if you frame it as race-based, is it because the color of the skin, or is it because of racialization, structural racism, and in prostate cancer, reduced PSA screening, diagnosed at later stages, less guideline concordant care, reduced access to care, higher rates of obesity and comorbidities, they may not even receive the same care, mass medical mistrust that is very warranted from things that were done to the Black community that we need to reach out and overcome, attribution bias, quality of care, and countless differences. And so my journey continues, and these are just some of the reflections and lessons that I share with you, is that, find what your purpose is and never stop questioning and pushing for progress. The only change that comes from doing nothing is decay. If you ever find yourself saying it's just the way it is, or I can't explain why, but it is this way, just pause and trace the origins of why you believe what you believe. And I can tell you, this is probably the basis of almost all of my research, because when you really go back, sometimes there's not even data or research why we do what we do or believe what we believe, or if we do, the data is exceptionally flawed. Question everything. sometimes the obvious answer is the right answer, like in this case. Is it some crazy hidden gene that no one's found, or is it simply all these other obvious components? And then be open to admit you don't know something, but have the respect to go learn as much as you can about it before asking for assistance. I think this is very relevant on this topic, in that clearly I was ignorant beyond belief, and I still am learning. But you have to go and actually, a lot of this has been written about for decades upon decades and decades, and it's simply taking the time to read about it. And what's interesting, when I talked to, I had a African-American nurse back at University of Michigan when I was doing this work, and a lot of these points, which were high impact papers we were doing, plenary podium presentations, grants and awards, and she was like, this is the most obvious thing ever, Dan. We've known about this in my family for decades. It's just so obvious. So take the time to actually, discuss with people. And then pushing against the norm is often not welcome. I can tell you that, as benign looking as those research papers seem, I have had many people, including federal funding, certain people in funding bodies, researchers whose careers are based on getting funding for race-based research, that they want there to be a genetic difference. You are going to challenge the norm, but I think, I think we're on the right side of history, and, I'm lucky to work with Randy and, keep pushing forward. So thank you guys so much for the opportunity to speak today.
Thank you so much. I think I shared earlier when we had a chance to meet, my background is public health with that focus in health equity. So I love how you are pushing that narrative of race-based versus race consciousness. And thank you for sharing some of your personal story with us. We truly appreciate that. Next, I asked Dr. Vince to come and present. Thank you.
Okay. I want to first and foremost say, Dan, Dr. Spratt, that was amazing. I'm equally as honored and humbled to, share the stage with you today. I also want to thank the coordinators for this opportunity. So I'll just go ahead and get started on talking a little bit about my journey into men's health and social justice. And I'll start from the beginning when we talk about my journey. As you can see from these pictures of me as a young child, to the far left and far right. I was born and raised in Baltimore, Maryland. Specifically, I'm from the west side of Baltimore. My grandparents, they were people who, worked out of poverty to lower middle class. But, in the 60s and 70s, just like many cities across this country, that was a wave of drugs, violence, and poverty ensued. And so because of that, we had, all of the struggles that you all know on this call that are related to, cities like Baltimore, but it's not just Baltimore, it's other cities like Detroit, DC, Philadelphia, New Orleans, Memphis, Cleveland, take your pick. And it was these experiences as well as watching some of my family members that I gained two things. One was a sense of service. So I remember my grandmother telling me, it's not what you can do for yourself, but what you can do for others. But then, I also started to question, well, why is it that these struggles appear to be happening or appear to be mostly in Black neighborhoods? And so those two things stuck with me along my journey. And I'll kind of just detail a little bit more. So that sense of service and that curiosity, that initial question that I had as a child, they just stuck with me. And so this is a few examples of some things when we talk about the sense of service. So from on the far left, health fairs that I helped lead when I was a medical student for students from underserved neighborhoods, kids from underserved neighborhoods. In the middle, mentoring for young teenage boys. And then to the far right, some work that I did before coming here with the Detroit chapter of the NAACP. And so again, my desire was always this philosophy of leadership through service. I absolutely hate being the center of attention. So that was never my goal, but I always wanted to just serve. And as I continued along my medical journey, those two things that I talked to you about stayed with me. And I remember as I transitioned from being a child to an adult, I would constantly think about or read about how we define race in this country and how racism has impacted so many things when we talk about our country's history. And as I got into medical school, I started to see how widespread this was. And so I went to medical school in Louisiana. I was one of 5 Black students out of approximately 120. I was the only Black student to actually finish on time. And as Dr. Spratt showed you in that commentary or that piece that I put out in JAMA, I remember just listening to these disparities lectures and sitting there thinking to myself, why is it that it just seems from these lectures that all of these disparities are just an innate cause of having dark skin? And it did make me feel like I had all these feelings of despair. But then I started to think about, okay, how have we defined race in this country? And how is it that with the inaccurate biological definition, right, that we have assigned to race, how is it that just your skin color can now have this innate impact on how your genes are expressed? And it just didn't make sense to me. And the reason it didn't make sense to me, I want to lay out in these next couple of slides just a high-level overview. And so when we talk about our country, where we've been, and so I think it's important to kind of go back and think of the country's origin story and the fact that anti-Black racism was used to support support slavery. The other thing is medical research and the institution of medicine really were used to support slavery. And throughout history, we started to acknowledge it, but we've never really actually did the heavy lifting to reverse this foundation. And so here's a couple things of what I'm talking about. And so this is how this manifests. And so these are some things that you probably never heard of, and certain conditions or diseases that were classified in slavery and the antebellum South as conditions or diseases of the Negro. These include things like drapetomania or dysaesthesia ethiopica, which you probably never heard of, but let's just go through these really quickly so you can see how, in my view, how crazy this even sounds nowadays when we look at it. So drapetomania, the disease causing Negroes to run away. And this is actually from medical literature, where it says it is unknown to our medical authorities, although its diagnostic symptom. The absconding from service is well known to our planters and overseers. So in other words, on this plantation, this was something that was seen, and more medical authorities need to actually recognize this. Well, I think for anyone attending this or who will listen to this, running away from slavery, that's not a disease. In fact, if you think about the torture and the inhumane conditions of slavery, I think regardless of your race, you would want to run away from it and escape. Dysaesthesia ethiopica, mental illness causing laziness among slaves associated with skin insensitivity and as to be like a person half asleep. Well, when we think about this, being malnourished, working in treacherous conditions in the sun all day, tending fields, and then additionally, as you can see here on the left in this cartoon, like the slaves, when they were tending fields, were barefoot, and this is in the deep South, and we know that this predisposes people to having hookworms, which can cause these exact symptoms. And so for me, it just didn't make sense. And they say, well, because a symptom or a condition is more prevalent in one race over another, doesn't mean that race is the cause of that prevalence. And additionally, when we talked about, Dr. Spratt mentioned the concept of racialization, none of this stuff made sense to me. And that's kind of what has prompted me and pushed me along my journey. And so when we talk about racialization in our country, we've had these ambiguous blood fractioning laws like the 1-drop rule or the 1/8 rule. 1/8 rule saying that if one of the 8 most immediate ancestors of yours was classified as Negro or Black, then so are you, even if the other 7 are majority European ancestry. So you can see how these things just don't make biological sense. And that is part of the reason why, as a fellow, I penned this commentary that was published in JAMA, because this was shortly after the murder of George Floyd. And I was having this conversation with another mentor of mine, Ganesh Palapatu, who's the chair at University of Michigan. And I was actually just having like a frustrated rant about all of the ways that I saw this coming together and how I thought and saw that society as a whole had just continued to turn a blind eye to a lot of injustices and inequities that impact marginalized people, specifically Black people, and how this leads to the unnecessary loss of life. And so I even, within this, I detailed some of my journey, and I also put forward 5 steps, which you can see here on the right, of ways that I thought the institution of medicine could sought to bring about change and kind of spearhead that change. Additionally, I wanted to call on the institution of medicine, which has a large amount of social capital, to start to push for that change, because it was imperative that we use that capital for good. But then as I continued to start to think about this, and on my journey, I learned more about the interaction of race, place, and health. And after the murder of George Floyd, we've talked about social determinants of health more, which you can see here some examples. But all along my journey, I continued to see how environmental, social, or societal, should I say, and health factors are ultimately discussed as social determinants of health, but how these things ultimately impact the lives of our patients on a daily basis. And then I coupled that with publications from other scientific specialties that I read, which showed that even in pretty genetically homogeneous populations, like this study was conducted in the Philippines, just merely living in poverty and the associated exposures can have a large part on altering gene expression. And then to kind of put a bow on top of all of this, I began looking at these life expectancy differences across neighborhoods. And here's a personal example of the differences. So the area in Baltimore, which I'm from, is considered the Greater Mondawmin area. And you can see median life expectancy is about 70 years. And I remember being in 5th grade at Hilton Elementary School, and I did so well on this math portion of a standardized test that the city actually offered to pay 50% for me to go to middle school in a different neighborhood, which was Roland Park. And you can see there's almost a 14-year difference in life expectancy between these two neighborhoods, even though it's only separated by a few miles. But I bet you if you would have guessed the demographic makeup of these two neighborhoods, you would be very accurate in your assumption. And this isn't in cities like Baltimore. This has been in other places I've seen and all across the country, really. So this is an example of life expectancy map in Richmond, Virginia, where I did my residency. As you can see, this Galpin neighborhood, 63 years median life expectancy versus the Museum District, which was 77 years. And I've drove this between these two neighborhoods, and it's literally less than 3 miles apart. And we even see it here within Cleveland, when you look at places like Lyndhurst and Sinclair Superior. And this map doesn't even include neighborhoods like Huff and Fairfax. And so it was through these experiences and gaining knowledge and largely as well conversations with people like Dr. Dan Spratt, who kind of motivated me to continue challenging the system. And so we did that with this research. And so with that being said, prostate cancer, which we know represents perhaps the greatest racial disparities in outcomes in all of cancer. And so we stepped back and we were just talking, and we were like, well, how do we actually talk about race, or do we even mention racism within the literature that we're publishing? And so we looked at all of these prostate cancer studies that did a comparative analysis, and looking specifically at disparities within prostate cancer. And what we found is that over time, as you can see here, the number of studies that are published year after year kind of increase. But when we talk about the number of studies that actually mention race as a social construct, like Dr. Spratt first talked about, and I talked about earlier in my presentation, and then you look at the number of studies even mentioning anything about racism, and you see it's negligible at best. So that's race and racism. What about social determinants of health? And the thought was that if we can't even describe race accurately, or even mention anything about racism and its current day impacts, then are we doing a good job with incorporating social determinants of health into our analysis And then further on, how does social determinants of health actually impact prostate cancer outcomes? And so what we did was a meta-analysis. We included all studies that did a comparative analysis between Black and white men when it comes to prostate cancer, specific mortality or dying from prostate cancer, and overall survival. And across all 5 of these domains, which you see that were published from the Department of Health and Human Services, we were able to identify variables across each one of these 5 domains. And so we looked at when studies do a poor job of, we scored all of these studies based on how well they did or how many of these variables they included within their analysis. And so each study based off of that score was kind of categorized as low, intermediate, or high. And so here's what we found. When we talk about prostate cancer specific mortality or dying from prostate cancer, those studies that did a poor job of including those variables, you can see the disparity is stark, that Black men are at much higher risk of dying from prostate cancer. But as we start to improve how we include social determinants of health into our analysis, then you should see that disparity starts to dissipate. And actually, for those studies that did a good job of incorporating social determinants of health variables, you see that Black men were actually at a lower risk of dying from prostate cancer. And you see a similar trend here when we talk about overall survival. And so I know we're running short on time, so I want to start to wrap up. But before we do, as we continue to push for equity, I want to just kind of have some food for thought. And I want to pose this question because I think it's really important as we think about ways to move forward. And the question is, how do we make progress if we can't even properly describe race and the impact of racism? So for every researcher, every clinician, I think that it's important that we start to look at race as what it is, a social construct. We have to acknowledge the history of racism in our country and the current day implications it has. And then this history of racism largely impacts social determinants of health. And these social determinants of health have a very real impact on our patients' health outcomes. And so I'll stop there. But before I do, I made a promise to myself before I started medical school that if I ever had the opportunity to speak in any venue, that I would honor my family. And so I'm gonna do that really quickly by honoring my dad, where you can see a picture of me and him on the left, who I lost at the age of 12, but I navigate this world every day hoping I can be a man he could be proud of. And then a picture of my beautiful mother on the right, who I love wholeheartedly. And I thank both of them for what they've instilled in me. And so I want to again thank you all for the opportunity to present, and I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. And again, much appreciation of looking at things from that societal point of view. I'm definitely going to check out the article you mentioned. And thank you for bringing up education disparities and how that affects our livelihood and further impacts our health outcomes. So thank you, much appreciation. As you know, we are so thankful to have both of you contribute to our vision of advancing the science of health and the art of compassion, the vision of university hospitals. I know your videos are on, so we will now begin our question and answer portion of the webinar. For those in attendance, please feel free to type your questions in that Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We will get to as many of them as possible. So let us begin. I know both of you talked about your journeys, and we appreciate that. With the time that we have, is there anything that you else would want to share about your journey, like that little bit of encouragement if someone is thinking about going to medical school or entering the research realm of medicine? What would that be? We could start with whoever, Dr. Spratt.
Yeah, I think, medicine, I would always just make sure it's not unique to medicine. I think that try to do your best to make sure this is actually what you want to do. And what I mean by want is, some people, talk about wants. Like I'll tell my kids, they're like, oh, I want a Ferrari. I'm like, well, do you want a Ferrari? And do the work and everything it's going to take to have one? Is that really what you want? what gets you going. And I think I was fortunate, and it's not a unique thing, but I think many people that I see succeed and are very passionate in our field or in any field is that it's really their calling, their purpose. It's definitely healthcare. Being a physician is challenging in many ways. And so if you don't have that North Star to kind of really know why you're doing what you're doing, I think it's challenging. So have that in the beginning, and then, never let go of it.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And, another similarity that Dr. Spratt and I have is, he mentioned how, coming in high school, he wasn't a great student, and neither was I, but because we developed these passions, like you said, and we did have that North Star, we wanted to be able to become a physician and challenge, the way that things were and really benefit people for the better. I would say, even if you weren't a great student, like this is still something that is very doable and obtainable if this is something you want.
Thank you. Another question. What are some things researchers can implement into their research to ensure a diverse population? And Dr. Vince, let's start with you first.
Well, I think first and foremost, you gotta be thoughtful about it, right? Like, oftentimes, as Dr. Spratt alluded to, and I've even talked to him about this before, we'll have papers that say, oh, we saw this difference in Black men, and it'll be like 20 Black men compared to, 300 white men. And it's like, what kind of comparison is that, so we have to be very thoughtful about it. The other thing that I think we have to be thoughtful about, should I say, is, for lack of a better way of putting it, is the history of medical mistrust, right? And how that impacts patients wanting to be involved in research at all. So I think, kind of those are two really simple things, and well, at least they seem simple to me, that we could be very cognizant and conscientious of to help improve the diversity within our research. I think I froze. Did I freeze for a second?
Yes.
Okay. I don't know what was the last part of what you heard. I'm sorry.
Sorry, my internet, I'm at UH, my internet went out for a minute, so I'm sorry about that.
Okay. I don't know what the last part you guys heard, so I'm sorry if I got cut off.
You're fine. Dr. Spratt, is there anything you would like to add
Sure.
to that?
Yeah, I think that, I think what Randy was saying, we have to, as physicians and as researchers and, our healthcare community needs to be the one to reach across, to, regain that trust. And it's not, I think the mindset of, hey, we have trials, come and roll on them, right? It's like, there's going to be large sectors of people that are just not going to have that trust. So I think unique aspects and approaches need to be done. Even though, I fully accept, right, I am a white Jewish man and treating prostate cancer, and in Cleveland, 48% of, people are Black. And so a lot of my patients, prostate cancer, are Black men. And I think it's just being honest and very real with them. And it's talking and it's addressing these things, right? It's talking about why don't you, what concerns you about the trial. It's gaining that trust. And sometimes it takes longer. Sometimes there's multiple conversations. And there's a lot of things going on at UH, there's work. One of my faculty, his name is Dr. Woody McClelland. He for both breast and prostate cancer has funding to try to use navigators to actually get into the communities, to try to really, reduce any barriers. I think someone in urology, Dr. Shoag, that works with Dr. Vince and me, I think he's got a barbershop type grant to help, get into the communities to talk about PSA screening. And I think that's needed when you talk about how do you have a diverse sample or diverse representation, right? And I think we're uniquely poised here in Cleveland because a lot of the, we'll call it large academic centers in the US have very, very few African Americans in their catchment, right? They may be the ivory tower, but the inner city hospital sees actually more of the African American community. So I think we're uniquely poised here, and I think we're doing great things, a lot more great things to come.
Thank you. There are so many questions in the chat. I'm going to see how many we can get to. And there's a lot of kudos. So thank you all for that. For both of you, and this time start with Dr. Sweat. We often talk about physician bias against patients of color. Have you experienced bias from patients, and how did you deal with it?
Me?
That's the question.
I don't know if I have. If I have, it doesn't matter. I mean, right, I've got a lot of privilege, and I think that for me, it's more. I view it as I'm fortunate to be able that, the various, I've worked and lived in New York City and various places in here with diverse populations that I view it's my job, right? It's a physician's job. It's not about me. It's about the patient and their family to learn and gain. So yeah, I'm sure there are reactions, but I don't feel like I've been in any way discriminated against. I'd be curious to Dr. Vince's point of view, how he feels about that.
Yeah. More recently, not as much. But I have, like I said, I did medical school in Louisiana. I did residency in Richmond, Virginia, which is the former capital of the Confederacy. And I walked right by the Confederate White House every day going into the hospital. And so some of those mindsets are still ingrained in people when they see a Black man as a surgeon or as a medical student. And so, yeah, I have dealt with biases. I have, when I was in medical school, going in and taking a history, had people tell me, I don't want you involved in my care, simply because I was Black. And so.
One more question, maybe two. Have you noticed any trends or increases in men being more mindful about certain aspects of their health, since you face is a direct or indirect effect of your work or otherwise, like more screenings, more regular checkups, etc.?
Can you say that again, Patricia?
Yep.
I think you said.
Have you noticed, this is the question from an audience member, have you noticed any trends or increases in men being more mindful about certain aspects of their health since you've been working in this space as a direct or indirect effect of your work or otherwise, like more screenings, more regular checkups?
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, I would love to say yes, but when you're talking about how common prostate cancer is, this is one of those things that it's not impossible, but it's actually very challenging to measure. So I think that, there's been a lot of work going on about how to increase, screening rates and focused efforts. But if I were just to objectively look at what's been reported throughout like the United States, it's pretty disappointing, and I think Dr. Vince and I looked over, a 60-year period, the disparities between Black and white men in terms of mortality and incidence has, not really shifted. So I think there's a lot of work to do.
Thank you. And so one last question as we wrap up, and I hope Dr. Vince is still on. What podcast? Oh, awesome. What podcast recommend? Like, what is that one either you're listening to for entertainment or professional growth that you would want other people to have that shared experience?
So for me, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So actually the one podcast that I listen to a lot that I really enjoy, if you couldn't tell from my presentation, is I like to look at the historical perspective of things and how it has current day impacts. And so the one podcast that I listen to is actually an NPR podcast. It's called Throughline. And they address many different topics, but they always go back to historical events and then trace those historical events to present day. So that's the one podcast that I really enjoy listening to.
And Dr. Spratt, any books or podcasts that you can recommend to the audience? No.
I am deep in my own rabbit hole right now, reading about AI everything. So I'm more of, I'm not reading, books or listening to podcasts. Get in my
Yep.
rabbit hole
Thank
of
you.
articles online and YouTube, but